everyone. This conference asks what openness really means in academic libraries, and I would like to press on that question from the vantage point of digital accessibility, because a library website can satisfy digital accessibility requirements like WCAG 2.1 level AA and still not be open. Compliance does not tell us whether someone can actually participate. And that's not a design flaw, it's actually a structural limit. And it requires a foundational shift in how we think about the relationship between openness and accessibility. So most of our institutions treat compliance and openness as the same project, but they're actually not. And until we pull those two ideas apart, we can't honestly ask what openness means for disabled users. Disability rights represent a lifetime of advocacy and a matter of dignity. And when we make those rights measurable, we inherently narrow them down to something we can quantify. So compliance measures conformance against a technical standard, but openness asks whether someone can actually participate. And those are not the same question. And treating them as interchangeable has real consequences for disabled users and ones that institutions rarely see, because they're looking at the audit oftentimes rather than the experience. So where did this commitment come from? Libraries did not discover access when regulations required it. The commitment to openness is older than every digital accessibility standard we now work under. In the 1950s, we were already producing print materials for the visually impaired, and by 1871, we had published a first Braille book. And before the end of the 19th century, the Library of Congress had even opened up a dedicated reading room. These were not compliance gestures. No regulation required them. Libraries did this because openness was the institutional commitment. Being open and available to the communities we serve was not an aspiration. It was the premise. The question, who can participate and on what terms, is not new. And what is new is the way that compliance culture has given institutions a way to answer that question without actually asking it. You can run audits, you get scores, but sometimes the harder question quietly disappears. So let me be fair to compliance. Compliance is not the enemy here. Compliance frameworks do really important work. They establish a shared technical baseline, they give institutions a common language for standards, and they create legal accountability where none have existed before, and that matters. But here's what they cannot do. They cannot tell you whether a disabled user can actually accomplish what they came to your library site to do. These standards evaluate whether an interface meets a set of codified success criteria. It does not evaluate whether the experience of those criteria produce something that someone can actually participate in. That's not a failure of any particular audit. It's just a boundary of what compliance was designed to measure. It answers a legal question, but it was never really meant to build an experiential one. And when institutions treat the legal answer as if it were the experiential answer, the gap between conformance and participation is easy to overlook, not because people aren't paying attention, but because the framework itself does not surface it. So what does this look like in practice? So in practice, and I'm going to draw from my own institution here because we do this as well, we have an interface in our library that is keyboard accessible. Every element is reachable, the tab order is logical, there are no keyboard traps, it passes. And in completing a routine task, like placing a hold or exporting a citation, some of these tasks require navigating more than a dozen sequential keystrokes with no shortcut logic. And in one case, it took me over 40 keystrokes to get to the next page that I was desiring. So for a user that relies on keyboard as their primary mode of access, this is not a minor inconvenience. This is the library communicating something about who this was designed for. And the audit checked whether the interface was operable by a keyboard. And it is. But what the audit could not check is whether the experience it produced was one in which a keyboard user could realistically participate. And that's the gap. It did not show up because someone was being careless. It did not show up because the framework was never designed to see it. I want to be clear about what this example illustrates. It's not an implementation failure. No one made an error. The compliance framework was applied correctly and it returned the correct result. But that's precisely the point. The gap that exists between conformance and participation is not produced by institutions doing compliance badly. It's produced by institutions doing compliance well and stopping there. The audit becomes the endpoint rather than the starting point, and the space between conformance and genuine openness can go unexamined. So compliance asks, does this interface meet the criteria? But openness asks, can this person do what they came here to do? And those questions live in completely different domains. And no amount of better auditing closes the distance between them. And that's not a reason to abandon compliance, but it is a reason to stop treating compliance as if it answers the question of openness. It does not, and it never really did. So we all have pressure, and it's real. None of this is abstract. The regulatory landscape is shifting significantly. The European Accessibility Act is reshaping vendor obligations across the EU. In the US, ADA Title II now includes digital accessibility requirements. Institutions on both sides of the Atlantic are under real pressure, and that pressure is legitimate. Libraries should comply. That's not the question here. But look at where the pressure is landing institutionally. It is landing on procurement checklists, maybe vendor audit reviews or audit scores that can be reported upward. These are necessary instruments, of course, but when they become the primary way an institution engages with accessibility, something narrows. The conversation becomes, what can we demonstrate to a regulator rather than what can we provide to a user? And so the urgent question becomes, are we covered rather than are we open? And the gap between those two questions is exactly the space where disabled users' experiences might disappear from institutional view. Urgency is not really the problem. It's whether or not we let compliance define the limits of our commitment to openness. So where do we go from here? Where does this leave us? Not with a rejection of compliance. Compliance is a great thing, but with a question that compliance cannot answer. Can disabled users participate equally in the digital spaces our libraries provide? Not partially, not with workarounds, but equally. We should be asking whether the experiences we design and communicate show disabled users that they were considered, not merely accommodated. So what does openness look like if it's not compliance? It looks like treating disabled users' reported experiences as evidence that carries the same institutional weight as an audit score. It looks like building feedback mechanisms where disabled users can tell you something is not working, and that information actually changes what you do. It looks like asking during the design and procurement process, not just, does this meet the standard, but who are we designing this for, and can they use it? And it looks like understanding that accessibility is not a problem you solve once, it's a relationship you maintain. Truthfully, compliance is the floor, and openness is what we start to build from there. I want to leave you with this. When you go back to your libraries and the next conversation about digital accessibility comes up, and it will, I hope you think about it just a little differently. I hope you ask not whether your digital spaces meet the standard, but whether disabled users can genuinely participate them. That shift from compliance to participation and one from coverage to openness is not a small one, but it's one that honors what libraries have always been here for, openness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. It was great to hear about how there needs to be, I suppose, culture changes in workplaces in order to change that idea from, like you said, compliance to participation. If anyone's got any questions, do pop them in the chat. I can't see any at the moment, so I'll just take this opportunity to ask one of my own, which is,